Everyone who sees the flying V for the first time locks onto the same thing. That shape, that impossible, boomerang, V-shaped body that looks like it flew straight off the cover of a science fiction novel. And yeah, the shape is wild. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. The most radical thing about this aircraft isn't the wing you can't stop staring at. It's what has to hang off the back of it. Because to make a plane like this actually leave the ground, to lift more than 300 people and their luggage and haul them across an entire ocean, you need an engine so enormous, so absurdly powerful, that the whole aircraft basically has to be shaped around it. So let's start with the obvious question. What actually powers something like the Flying V? To understand why the answer is so big, you first have to understand what this plane really is. Because the Flying V isn't some napkin sketch a designer dreamed up between coffees. It's a serious research aircraft developed at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, backed by the airline KLM, with technical input from Airbus. The idea itself was born from a graduate thesis by a young engineer named Justus Benade, who first sketched it out while working at Airbus in Hamburg around 2014. TU Delft has been developing it ever since, roughly since 2016, under project leader Roelof Vos. This is not a fantasy. This is a decade of serious, patient engineering. Oh, and one quick thing before we dive deeper, because it always gets a reaction. That name isn't an accident. When the Flying V was first unveiled, a lot of people noticed it shares its name with something completely unrelated, the Gibson Flying V, that iconic angular electric guitar that first showed up back in 1958 and split opinion right down the middle the moment it appeared. The aircraft wears the same name for exactly the same reason. It's a bold, angular, love it or hate it shape that flatly refuses to look like anything else in the sky. And honestly, once you know that, it fits perfectly. Now, the numbers behind this thing are not modest at all. The full-scale Flying V is designed to have the exact same wingspan as an Airbus A350, one of the most advanced airliners flying today. Same 65 meters, tip to tip. It's a bit shorter overall, around 55 meters nose to tail, and it stands roughly 17 meters tall. It's built to carry an enormous load, somewhere around 360 passengers in a two-class layout, plus about 160 cubic meters of cargo, and it swallows something like 140,000 liters of fuel. Read those numbers again, slowly. This is a full-size, long-haul, intercontinental machine, sitting in the exact same weight class as the jets you already fly on today. And the way it fits all those people inside is genuinely strange and clever. Because the cabin is built right into the wings, passengers wouldn't sit in a single long tube the way they do now. They'd sit spread across the two legs of the V, in multiple aisles, with the seats angled slightly relative to the direction of flight, so everything fits inside that swept shape. It's a completely different way of thinking about the inside of an airplane, and the Delft team has poured real effort into designing the seating, the layout, even the bathrooms, to make that unusual space actually feel comfortable to a normal passenger. And the reason they go to all this trouble ties directly back to fuel. The project leader has explained it pretty simply. The Flying V is smaller than an A350 for the same amount of usable interior volume, which means less surface area rubbing against the air, which means less drag. Less drag means less thrust needed. And less thrust needed means less fuel burned for the very same journey. The whole radical shape exists to chase that one number down. Everything, the angled seats, the integrated cabin, the missing tail, all of it serves that single goal of sipping less fuel. And that, in turn, is why the engine choice matters so enormously. Because you want engines that are just as obsessed with efficiency as the airframe wrapped around them. And that matching wingspan, by the way, is not a coincidence either. It's a stroke of practical genius. By keeping the exact same 65 mattress span as an A350, the Flying V could slot straight into the airport gates, taxiways, runways, and hangars that already exist all over the world. Airports wouldn't have to rebuild a single thing to handle it. That might sound like a boring detail next to giant fans and record-breaking thrust, but it's actually one of the smartest decisions in the entire design. History is littered with brilliant aircraft that struggled because they were too big or too oddly shaped for existing airports. By deliberately fitting inside the same footprint as a plane airlines already operate, the Flying V quietly erases one of the biggest obstacles a radical new design usually trips over. It's a good reminder that great engineering isn't only about the flashy stuff. Sometimes it's about making sure your revolutionary machine can actually park at the gate. Now hold that thought. Same wingspan as an A350. Same passenger count, same cargo. That is a big, heavy, long-range beast. And a machine like that does not float into the sky on good intentions and clever aerodynamics alone. It needs raw, brutal thrust. So when the engineers describe how the Flying V would be powered, they don't reach for anything exotic or tiny. They say it's designed around the most fuel-efficient turbofan engines that currently exist. In plain language, that means a modern giant. The same class of engine you'd find slung under the wing of that A350 it keeps getting compared to. And to give you a real, physical sense of scale, picture the engine that actually powers the A350, the Rolls-Royce Trent XWB. The fan at the front of that thing, just the fan, is about 3 meters across, made up of 22 swept blades. 3 meters. That's taller than most rooms in your house. It runs a 3-shaft architecture, which is Rolls-Royce's signature design, with a bypass ratio of around 9.5 to 1 and an overall pressure ratio of about 50 to 1. And depending on the version, it can crank out anywhere from 84,000 to 97,000 pounds of thrust. Rolls-Royce likes to call it the most fuel-efficient large aero engine in the world, and it's the fastest-selling wide-body engine they have ever made. Let those numbers just sit there for a second, because we're going to come back to how genuinely insane they really are. Here's a detail that catches a lot of people completely off guard, though. Boeing doesn't build these engines. Neither does Airbus. And no, TU Delft isn't going to weld one together in a lab either. The world of gigantic jet engines belongs to a small, elite handful of specialist companies. Names like General Electric, Rolls-Royce, and Pratt & Whitney. The airframe, the body of the plane, and the engine, the thing that pushes it, are basically 2 separate universes, built by 2 entirely different sets of engineers, using 2 completely different sets of skills, and then married together right at the very end of the process. Airbus makes the A350. Rolls-Royce makes its engines. 2 companies, 2 enormous problems, 1 finished aircraft. So when we talk about the enormous engine of the Flying V, we're really talking about the kind of colossal, cutting-edge turbofan that a specialist engine maker would build, and that the whole aircraft was drawn around from day one. And I want to hammer home just how much muscle a plane in this exact class really demands, because the numbers are genuinely wild. Take that Trent XWB again. The version on the smaller A350 puts out about 84,000 pounds of thrust. The version on the bigger, longer-range A350-1000 gets pushed all the way up to 97,000. And Rolls-Royce got that extra power in a fascinating way. They kept the fan the exact same size, but they made the engine core about 5% bigger and spun the fan roughly 6% faster, which then forced them to fit thicker titanium fan blades and strengthen the entire casing, just to survive the increased forces. Because here's the iron law of engines. Push one harder and it runs hotter, and running hotter means more wear, especially in brutal hot and sandy climates, which has sparked a very public, very expensive argument in the airline world about how long these high-thrust engines can really last. That's the razor's edge these machines live on. Every extra pound of thrust you squeeze out costs you something, somewhere else. And to put the raw forces in perspective, on an engine like this, a single high-pressure turbine blade, a piece of metal small enough to hold in one hand, generates something like 800 horsepower entirely on its own. The whole engine can inhale well over 600 kilograms of air every single second. That is the scale of thing the Flying V needs. 2 of them, bolted onto a wing that also happens to be the passenger cabin. So that's the what. Now comes the question that actually matters, and the answer is going to flip your intuition completely upside down. Why does the engine have to be so enormous in the first place? Why not just bolt on a few small ones and call it a day? This is where it gets genuinely fascinating. You'd think a more powerful engine would be a smaller, angrier, more compact thing, screaming out a tight jet of super-fast air. That's how the old jets worked, back in the days when airliners were loud and thirsty and left long black smears of smoke across the sky. And it turns out that screaming jet is just about the least efficient way to fly that there is. There are basically 2 ways to make thrust. You can take a small amount of air and blast it out the back really, really fast. Or you can take an enormous amount of air and push it out the back just a little bit faster than it came in. Both give you thrust. Newton genuinely does not care which one you pick. But here's the kicker, and it's the single most important idea in all of modern jet propulsion. Moving a huge mass of air slowly is dramatically more efficient than moving a tiny bit of air violently. It sips far less fuel for every pound of push you get out of it. And in a world where fuel is the single biggest cost an airline faces month after month after month, that difference isn't a rounding error. It is the entire ballgame. So how do you move an enormous mass of air? Simple. You build an enormous fan. The bigger the fan, the more air it can grab and sling gently backward, and the more of your thrust comes from that slow, efficient column of air instead of the hot, thirsty jet of fire in the middle. Engineers measure this with something called the bypass ratio. That's the ratio between the air that flows around the engine's core and the air that flows through it. On these modern giants, that ratio sits at around 10-to-1, and sometimes even higher. 10 times more air flowing gently around the outside than through the burning heart of the machine. Older engines from decades ago had bypass ratios of 5-to-1, or 3, or 1, or effectively none at all. The entire history of jet efficiency is basically the story of that number climbing and the fan swelling wider and wider to match it. And that is exactly why the engine is so big. It is not big to look intimidating out on the ramp. It's big because, in this game, size is efficiency. That gaping mouth at the front is doing most of the work, and it's doing it so gently that most of the air rushing through it never even comes close to a flame. And it's genuinely worth pausing here on how far all of this has come, because it explains why old planes and new planes feel so completely different when they take off. The very first jet airliners used turbojets, engines with essentially no bypass at all. Every scrap of air went straight through the fire and got blasted out the back at enormous speed. They were powerful, sure, but they were also deafeningly loud. They drank fuel like it was free, and they left those long, dark trails of smoke you can still see in old footage. Then engineers started adding a fan up front and letting some of the air bypass the core entirely, and efficiency took a huge leap. Rolls-Royce, in particular, built much of its reputation on a clever three-shaft layout that let different sections of the engine spin at their own ideal speeds, a piece of engineering DNA that still runs straight through the Trent family today. And every single decade since, that bypass ratio has crept upward, the fans have grown wider, and the engines have gotten quieter and thriftier almost perfectly in lockstep. The giant, gentle, whisper-quiet turbofans of today are the direct descendants of those screaming early jets, refined across more than 60 years of stubborn, incremental, unglamorous progress. If you're finding this stuff as satisfying as I am, do me a quick favor and hit that like button and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one. It genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think, and it tells me you actually want the real engineering, not just the shiny surface stuff. All right, back into it. Which brings us to the next question, and it's honestly the one I find the most beautiful of them all. If the fan is doing most of the work, then what on earth is actually happening deep inside that giant? What is going on in there? Let me take you on the exact journey a single gulp of air takes when it gets sucked into one of these things. Engineers have a wonderfully blunt way of describing the whole cycle. Suck, squeeze, burn, blow. 4 steps. That's the entire engine, from the very front of the fan to the very back of the nozzle. And once these 4 words click into place for you, you understand jet propulsion better than most people ever will. Step 1. Suck. The huge fan at the front spins and inhales a colossal amount of air, thousands of kilograms of it every single second. But right behind that fan, the air immediately splits into 2 completely different lives. Most of it, the vast majority, goes rushing around the outside of the engine core through a smooth duct, never touching any flame at all. This is the bypass air. This is the calm river. And on a modern high-bypass engine, this cool, gentle stream produces up to 80% of the total thrust. Read that one more time and let it land. 80% of the push that lifts a 300-ton airliner comes from air that never gets burned at all. The screaming hot core buried in the middle only handles the remaining fraction. Step 2. Squeeze. The smaller slice of air that does go into the core now gets funneled into the compressor. This is a long series of spinning blades, stage after stage after stage, and each stage packs the air tighter and tighter and tighter. By the time it's finished, the pressure has climbed to something like 40 times what it started at, and on the very newest engines, even higher than that. The GE9X, for one example, hits an overall pressure ratio of around 60-to-1. And here's a detail people never see coming. When you squeeze air that hard, it heats up violently, entirely on its own, before any fuel is involved. We are talking hundreds of degrees, purely from being compressed. The cold, thin air of the upper sky becomes something genuinely scorching, just from being crushed. Step 3. Burn. That superheated, supercompressed air finally arrives in the combustor, and this is where the real magic happens. Fuel gets sprayed in through carefully engineered nozzles, the mixture ignites, and the temperature rockets up past 2000 Kelvin. To give you a reference you can actually feel, that is hotter than the melting point of most of the metals you could name off the top of your head. Think about how insane that is. The gas rushing through the turbine is literally hotter than the melting point of the turbine itself. The only reason the parts survive is that engineers bleed cooler air through tiny channels inside them, wrapping each blade in a thin, invisible film of protection, so the metal never quite touches the full fury of the fire. The fact that these things run for thousands of hours in that environment, flight after flight, is one of the quiet miracles of the modern world that almost nobody thinks about. Let me put that temperature into terms you can actually picture. 2000 Kelvin is well over 1600 degrees Celsius. Lava pouring out of a volcano runs cooler than that. The inside of that combustor is genuinely hotter than molten rock, and it isn't some brief flash either. It's a continuous, precisely controlled inferno that has to burn rock steady for every second of a 14-hour flight. And sitting right in the direct blast of that inferno are the turbine blades, each one smaller than your hand, spinning at tens of thousands of RPM, each one generating hundreds of horsepower on its own. They survive because they're grown from special single crystal structures and threaded with microscopic cooling channels, and because that thin film of cooler air clings to their surface like an invisible heat shield. If even one of those blades ever failed, the results would be catastrophic. And yet they basically never do. That reliability, forged in a fire hotter than lava, is the entire reason you can fall asleep at 40,000 feet without giving it a second thought. Step 4. Blow. All that furious, expanding, white-hot gas comes blasting out the back of the combustor, and on its way out, it slams into a set of turbines, spinning them like a windmill caught in a hurricane. And here's the elegant part. The part that turns the whole thing into a self-sustaining loop. Those turbines are connected by shafts running right down the dead center of the engine, and their entire job is to power the compressor we just talked about, and, crucially, to drive that giant fan all the way back at the front. So the engine is quite literally feeding itself. The fire spins the turbines spin the shafts spin the fan and the compressor, the fan gulps in more air, the compressor crushes it, more fuel burns, and the whole cycle roars on, tens of thousands of revolutions per minute for an entire flight, without ever pausing. And here's a detail that genuinely blows people's minds when they first hear it. Those shafts running down the middle of the engine aren't just one shaft. They're nested inside each other, spinning independently. One hollow shaft turning inside another, like tubes within tubes within tubes. On a big Rolls-Royce engine, there are 3 of them, 3 separate spools, each one connecting a different set of turbines to a different set of compressors, and each one free to spin at its own perfect speed. The innermost might be turning at a few thousand RPM, while another screams along far faster, all of them concentric, all of them turning at the exact same moment, mere inches apart, and never once touching. It is one of the most quietly bonkers pieces of mechanical design anywhere in the world, and it is happening a few feet away from you every single time you fly, completely silent and totally invisible behind that big spinning fan. And there's a genuinely gorgeous bonus buried in all of this. Remember that huge column of cool bypass air wrapping around the outside of the core? It doesn't just make most of your thrust. It also forms a kind of sheath, a soft blanket of slower, cooler air that wraps itself around the violent, roaring hot jet in the middle. That cushion is a big part of why modern jets are so dramatically quieter than the howling, ear-splitting engines of the 1960s and 70s. The efficiency and the quiet come from the exact same trick, the same enormous fan. One single design choice, 2 huge payoffs. So now you know the secret. The reason these engines look like they're basically all fan and barely anything else is because, in the ways that matter most, they truly are. The fan is the star of the show. The fiery core in the middle is really just there to keep that fan spinning. But that raises an even trickier question, and it's one that quietly keeps aerospace engineers up at night. How do you build a fan that big, spinning that fast, without the whole thing tearing itself violently to pieces? Because this is where the engineering stops being merely clever and starts being borderline miraculous. Think for a moment about what you're actually asking a single fan blade to survive. Let's take the biggest commercial engine ever built for an airliner, the General Electric GE9X. Its fan is 134 inches across. That's about 3.5 meters, nearly as wide as the entire fuselage of a Boeing 737. Picture that clearly in your head. A fan almost as wide as the body of a plane you've very probably flown inside of. To put it yet another way, that fan stands taller than a regulation basketball hoop with a good foot to spare. If you stood a GE9X up on its end, the opening at the front would loom over you like a doorway built for a giant. The engine is over 5.5 meters long, and it weighs somewhere around 9,500 kilograms. It is, by absolutely any measure, a monster. And yet that enormous fan has only 16 blades. Just 16. That is fewer blades than the older engines it replaced, which sounds completely backward until you realize that each modern blade is now doing the work of several old ones. At full power, that fan spins at around 2,500 revolutions per minute, and every single blade is being flung outward by centrifugal force, carrying a load worth roughly 100 times its own weight. Each blade is essentially trying to rip itself clean off the hub, over and over and over, thousands of times a minute, for tens of thousands of flying hours, in rain, in hail, through flocks of birds, across the freezing thin air 5 miles up. So how on earth do they not fail? The answer is materials, and it's a story of decades of relentless, grinding progress. The blades are built from advanced carbon fiber composites, which makes them lighter, thinner, and stronger than the solid metal blades of the past. But composites have one real weakness. They can shatter on a hard enough impact. So the engineers cap each blade with a leading edge of titanium or steel, a tough metal lip that lets the blade shrug off a bird strike or a chunk of hail without disintegrating. Deeper inside, back in the blazing hot section behind the combustor, where ordinary metal would simply vaporize, they use something called ceramic matrix composites. These are exotic, painstakingly engineered materials that hold on to their strength in temperatures that would destroy steel outright. The GE9X carries well over 100 parts made from those ceramics. Every square inch of that engine is a compromise, fought out blow by blow, between what physics flatly forbids and what engineering can just barely pull off. And the cleverness goes so much deeper than just the fan. Inside the core, the GE9X runs an 11-stage high-pressure compressor, an intricate stack of spinning and stationary blades that cranks the core pressure ratio up toward 27:1 all by itself, which is a huge part of how the engine reaches that 60:1 overall figure. It uses an advanced combustor design to burn its fuel more cleanly, cutting nitrogen oxide emissions down to roughly half of what the regulations even permit. It borrows a lightweight carbon fiber composite fan case, a technology GE first pioneered on an earlier engine, to shave off yet more weight where it counts. And that decision to use fewer fan blades isn't laziness, it's a flex. Dropping down to just 16 blades means each remaining blade has to carry a dramatically higher load, and pulling that off without the blade tearing itself apart is a serious engineering achievement in its own right. And that trend toward fewer, mightier blades is a whole quiet revolution all by itself. Earlier generations of these big fans used more than 20 blades. Then the count dropped to 18, then down to 16. Each time, the blades got wider, stronger, and more aerodynamically sophisticated, so that fewer of them could do more work while weighing less and stirring up less turbulence in their own wake. It sounds like such a small thing, shaving off a few blades. But every blade you remove is weight you save and drag you avoid, and at this scale, those savings compound into real fuel and real money over the life of an engine. That's the kind of relentless, unglamorous optimization that separates a merely good engine from a record-breaking one. And GE tortured this engine to prove it could take it. Tens of thousands of test cycles, thousands upon thousands of hours running on the stand, deliberately firing dust and water and ice straight into it, freezing it solid, overspeeding it past its limits, all to make absolutely sure that when it finally carries paying passengers, it just quietly, boringly does its job. That is the level of paranoia and precision that hides behind every calm, uneventful flight you have ever taken. And the GE9X isn't just big, it is a genuine record holder. During testing, it generated over 134,000 pounds of thrust, and that earned it a Guinness World Record as the most powerful jet engine ever built. Just think about that phrase for a moment. The most powerful jet engine in human history. In everyday service, it's actually dialed back to a still monstrous 110,000 pounds of thrust, because it simply doesn't need to run flat out to do its job. It was designed to power Boeing's newest widebody, the 777X. Although here's a little reality check that surprises a lot of people. That plane still hasn't entered passenger service. After a long, painful string of delays, The first deliveries aren't expected until 2027, so even the mightiest engine ever built is, in a very real sense, still sitting patiently on the ground, waiting for its moment to shine, and none of this came out of nowhere, by the way. The GE9X was built directly on the bones of an earlier legend, the GE90, the engine that powered the Boeing 777 into becoming the long-haul workhorse of the entire world. The GE90 was the first commercial engine ever to break 100,000 pounds of thrust, a milestone that simply didn't exist before it. And its fan grew, generation after generation, from around 123 inches up toward 130. Each step wider, each step more efficient. The GE9X just took that exact same philosophy and pushed it right to the outer limit of what is currently possible. As for that 777X it powers, the plane itself is a beast, seating well over 400 passengers and featuring folding wingtips, an aviation first, so its enormous wings can shrink down to fit into normal airport gates. Everything about this class of machine is pushing against the edges of what infrastructure can even handle. And honestly, the story of getting that engine and that plane ready is a lesson all by itself in just how savage this kind of engineering really is. The 777X was originally supposed to be carrying passengers back in 2020. Instead, it ran into problem after problem. The GE9X had durability issues that had to be hunted down and fixed. Then, during testing, engineers discovered cracks in a structural link connecting the engine to the wing, which grounded the entire test fleet for months. The program has run something like 7 years late, and Boeing has swallowed roughly $15 billion in charges on it. 15 billion, with a B. And remember, this is a conventional plane, hanging conventional engines under a conventional wing, built by one of the two biggest aircraft makers on Earth, with decades of experience doing exactly this. Now cast your mind back to the Flying V, a radical tailless shape. Record-class engines mounted on top of a wing that is also the passenger cabin. Developed largely by a university research team, if a normal jet with underwing engines can slip 7 years and burn through $15 billion, you start to really grasp just how mountainous the Flying V's challenge truly is. And this isn't a knock on the project. It's the exact opposite. It's a reminder of how genuinely hard the thing they're attempting really is, and why every single careful step they take actually matters. And that brutal, expensive competition is exactly why efficiency has become the entire battleground of modern aviation. The A350 and the 777X are locked in a fight for the same lucrative long-haul routes, and the weapon they're fighting with isn't speed, and it isn't size. It's fuel burn per seat. Airlines pick between them by counting kilograms of kerosene on a spreadsheet. In a market that tight, a genuinely new shape promising a 20% saving isn't a gimmick. It's a potential earthquake, which is precisely why a serious national airline like KLM was willing to put its name behind a university research project in the first place. They aren't doing it for fun or for a nice press release. They're doing it because whoever cracks the next big leap in efficiency essentially owns the future of long-haul flying. And the engine, that enormous, patient, endlessly refined fan, sits right at the dead center of that entire fight. Comment below and tell me, honestly, did you have any idea a single jet engine could put out that kind of power? Because I'll be straight with you, the first time I actually sat down and understood these numbers, my jaw was on the floor. Okay, so if bigger fans mean better efficiency and more power, that leads to an obvious and slightly ridiculous question. Why not just keep going? Why not build an even bigger engine than the GE9X? Where does this actually stop? Well, somebody genuinely did try. Rolls-Royce built a demonstrator engine called the Ultrafan, and its fan measures 140 inches across. That's 3.5 meters and then some, and it makes the Ultrafan the largest aero engine ever built, bigger even than the record-setting GE9X. It first fired up in 2023 at a purpose-built facility in Derby called Testbed 80, which is itself the largest engine testbed in the world, built specifically because the existing test rigs simply weren't big enough to hold this thing. And on its very first runs, it burned 100% sustainable aviation fuel. Rolls-Royce says it promises to be around 25% more efficient than the first generation of their own Trent engines, and roughly 10% better than the current Trent XWB that flies on the A350 today. But notice the word I keep leaning on: demonstrator. The Ultrafan isn't hanging off any airliner you can book a ticket on right now. It's a rolling laboratory, a giant proof of concept, a way to test the technologies that might power the aircraft of the 2030s and beyond. And to make a fan that enormous actually work, Rolls-Royce had to add something genuinely clever: a gearbox. See, here's the fundamental tension at the core of every giant engine. The huge fan wants to spin slowly, because a slow-spinning fan is efficient and quiet. But the turbines buried deep inside want to spin fast, because a fast-spinning turbine makes more power. In older engines, those two conflicting demands were locked together on the same shaft, forcing an ugly compromise on both. So Rolls-Royce put a massive power gearbox in between them, letting the fan turn at its own ideal slow speed while the turbines scream away at their own ideal fast speed. That gearbox, built in Germany, handles around 50 megawatts of power in normal operation, and on the test bench it has pushed past 60 megawatts, roughly 87,000 horsepower. That's an aerospace record. And it's the equivalent power of hundreds of family cars, all funneled through a single component you could fit in the back of a van. So let's actually line these three giants up side by side for a second, because together they tell you the whole story of exactly where engines stand right now. First, the Rolls-Royce Trent XWB, with its 3-metre, 118-inch fan. That's the efficient workhorse, the most fuel-efficient large engine actually flying passengers today, hauling a 350S across the planet as we speak. Second, the General Electric GE9X with its 134-inch fan. That's the reigning champion, the largest and most powerful commercial engine ever certified, a genuine record breaker still patiently waiting for its plane to enter service. And third, the Rolls-Royce Ultrafan with its 140-inch fan. That's the future, the single largest aero engine ever built by anyone, anywhere, but still a demonstrator, a glimpse of the 2030s rather than something you can book a seat behind today. 3 engines, 3 clean steps up a ladder, and every single one of them is exactly the kind of colossal machine the Flying V would need to sling onto its back. So when the Delft team says their aircraft is designed around the most efficient turbofans that exist, this is the neighborhood they're shopping in. Not toys, not concepts, the absolute heavyweight champions of the entire engineering world. And the Ultrafan is deliberately built as a family, not a one-off. The technology is scalable, designed to flex anywhere from 25,000 pounds of thrust for a small narrowbody, all the way up to 100,000 pounds for a giant widebody. Rolls-Royce is working on a large version for the big long-haul jets and a smaller version for the narrowbody planes that make up the overwhelming bulk of the world's fleet. It uses an advanced new engine core and a lean-burn combustion system to cut emissions hard, dropping nitrogen oxides significantly and slashing noise. The demonstrator's testing has run in phases, with a second phase in 2025 pushing into flight tests, cold weather trials, and high-altitude starts, generating tens of terabytes of precious data. In fact, Rolls-Royce pointed out that the Ultrafan marked the first time in more than half a century, 54 years to be exact, that the company had tested a genuinely brand new engine architecture from a clean sheet. Just sit with that gap for a second. For decades, engine makers mostly refined and stretched and improved the designs they already had, squeezing out a few % of efficiency here and there. The Ultrafan represented a true leap, a new core, a new combustion system, new carbon titanium fan blades, all bundled into a single demonstrator and run flat out on a purpose-built test stand that cost around 90 million pounds just to construct. That's how significant the people who build these things consider this moment to be. They put up an entirely new kind of building just to test an entirely new kind of engine. Rolls-Royce is even running an entirely separate hydrogen demonstrator on the side. The point is, the people who build these engines are absolutely not sitting still. They are actively, aggressively trying to invent the thing that will make today's giants look old and slow. And it's genuinely worth asking why anyone is pouring this much money and effort into shaving down fuel burn at all, because the answer quietly touches everything. Fuel is, year in and year out, the single largest expense an airline carries on its books. A 20% cut isn't a nice little bonus. It's frequently the difference between a route that loses money and one that prints it. Now layer on top of that the steadily tightening emissions rules and the mounting public pressure to clean up aviation's environmental footprint, and suddenly a strange V-shaped plane that sips a fifth less kerosene stops looking like a curiosity and starts looking like a genuine glimpse of survival for the whole industry. But notice the deeper shift hiding inside this entire story. For most of aviation history, engineers built the engine to fit the plane. You designed the airliner first, and then you found or ordered an engine that would tuck neatly under its wing. What the Flying V represents, and what those ever-growing giant turbofans are quietly forcing on the whole industry, is the exact opposite instinct. Start with the most efficient possible way to move air, the biggest, gentlest fan you can physically build, and then design the entire aircraft around it. The engine stops being an accessory you hang on at the end. It becomes the seed the whole plane grows out from. And this is where we finally slam face first into a wall, because it turns out you genuinely cannot just keep making engines bigger forever. A bigger fan is a heavier fan. It creates more aerodynamic drag as the plane cuts through the air. It needs to sit high enough off the ground so it doesn't scrape the runway on takeoff, which forces the landing gear to grow taller and heavier, which adds even more weight, which then needs even more thrust to haul around in a vicious little circle that feeds on itself. And at some point, the engine gets so absolutely gigantic that it stops being a simple component you attach to a wing, and it starts becoming something the entire aircraft has to be reorganized around. One observer, watching these engines balloon in size year after year, put it perfectly. "We are reaching the point," they said, "where the aircraft may have to be built around the engines, rather than the engines being built to fit the aircraft." And if that sentence gives you a strange, prickling sense of déjà vu, it absolutely should. Because that is precisely, word for word, the exact problem the Flying V is wrestling with right now. Which brings us to the real, beating heart of this entire story. If these engines are so enormous, so heavy, and so demanding, then why is putting them on the Flying V such a spectacular nightmare? Here's the thing that makes the Flying V so different and so brutally, genuinely hard. Look at a normal, conventional airliner. The engines hang from pylons underneath the wings, out in clean, open, undisturbed air, well away from the body of the plane. And that plane has a tail at the back, with a horizontal stabilizer and a vertical fin, whose entire job is to keep everything balanced, stable, and pointed in the right direction. The Flying V has none of that. Zero. It is a tailless design. On this aircraft, the wing is everything. The wing is the body. The wing is the fuel tank. The wing is the cargo hold. And the wing is the passenger cabin, all of it folded together into that dramatic, swept-back V shape. There is no separate tail to trim things out. There is no clean, open space under the wing to just casually dangle a couple of engines. And that tailless shape creates deep challenges that go far beyond just the engines, which somehow makes the whole thing even more impressive. With no tail and no traditional flaps, the Flying V has to control itself in genuinely unusual ways. It leans on natural laminar flow over its wing to cut down drag. It uses its sheer enormous wing area and split speed brakes instead of the flap systems you'd find on a normal jet, and it's held steady by a fly-by-wire control system making constant, invisible corrections every fraction of a second. Inside, the pressurized cabin is built right into the wing and braced by reinforced structural walls that run along the legs of the V. It's designed to cruise at around Mach 0.8, roughly the same speed as the airliners you already fly on, up at about 35,000 feet. And because a tailless aircraft is inherently trickier to keep stable, researchers have been working hard on advanced, fault-tolerant flight control, systems clever enough to detect a failure the instant it happens and compensate for it automatically, keeping the whole aircraft steady, even if something goes wrong with a control surface mid-flight. So before you even arrive at the problem of where to hang two giant engines, you're already dealing with an aircraft that has to rewrite big chunks of the normal rulebook just to stay pointed the right way. Now stack the engine challenge right on top of all of that. Because mounting a giant engine up on top of a wing, rather than slung cleanly underneath it, is genuinely one of the trickier ideas in all of aerodynamics. Under the wing, out in open air, an engine breathes smooth, undisturbed, fast-moving air, which is precisely what it wants for its dinner. Up on top, and behind the wing, the air arriving at the engine has already been dragged across the wing's surface, so it shows up slower and messier, a thicker, more turbulent layer of flow. Feeding an engine that kind of disturbed, sluggish air can hurt its efficiency and put extra stress on the fan. But mount it up there, and you win that precious noise shielding, and you keep the giant fan safely away from the ground, away from stones and debris kicked up off the runway. So the whole thing becomes a delicate high-wire balancing act, a constant trade-off between noise, efficiency, structure, and safety, with no obviously perfect answer waiting at the end. Every choice you make buys you something and quietly costs you something else. This is exactly the kind of fiendish puzzle where you can run simulations for years and still be hunting for the sweet spot, which is precisely what the Delft team has been doing. So where on earth do the engines actually go? On the Flying V, They're mounted above and behind the wings, sitting on pylons on top of the aircraft toward the rear. And there are genuinely good reasons for that unusual choice. Putting the engines up high and to the back means the wing itself can act as a giant acoustic shield, physically blocking a lot of the engine's roar from ever reaching the ground below and from reaching the passengers sitting inside that very same wing. For anyone who lives under an airport flight path, and for anyone who has ever tried to sleep through a long overnight flight, that is a real and meaningful win. But it comes at a genuinely brutal cost. When you place a giant, air-guzzling engine right on top of a wing that is already doing all of the aerodynamic work, the engine starts to interfere with the delicate airflow over that wing. And on the Flying V, remember that airflow isn't just about squeezing out a little extra efficiency. It's about lift itself, and about control, and about basic stability, because the wing is quite literally the entire aircraft. Get the engine placement even slightly wrong, and you disturb the exact surface that is keeping 360 people suspended in the sky. It's a little like trying to balance a spinning fire hose on your shoulder while also using your own body as a surfboard. Everything affects everything else. There is no isolated, independent part you can tweak in a vacuum. And I want to be crystal clear about this, because it's the whole point. This is not a solved problem sitting neatly in a textbook. It is a live, open, genuinely unsolved question right now. As recently as 2025, the researchers at TU Delft were still running detailed aerodynamic simulations, the heavy computational kind that eat up serious computing power, specifically to figure out exactly where those engine nacelles should sit and how to stop them from wrecking the delicate flow over the wing. They are modeling the interference in fine detail. They are nudging the placement millimeter by millimeter. They are testing and retesting and testing yet again. The enormous engine that gives this entire aircraft its purpose and its power is also, by a wide margin, the single hardest thing to actually bolt onto it. And that exact tension between the raw power you desperately need and the aerodynamic chaos that power unleashes is where the whole Flying V project genuinely lives at this very moment. If you're still with me this deep into the video, then you are very clearly my kind of aviation nerd. So seriously, go ahead and subscribe and stick around, because there's one more twist coming in this story that I honestly think is going to surprise you. Because here's a question I'd bet good money you've been quietly turning over in the back of your mind this entire time. With all this talk of enormous, record-breaking, history-making engines, what has actually flown? What version of the Flying V has really, physically left the ground? And this is where I have to be completely, totally straight with you, because the honest answer is far more interesting than any hype could ever be. The full-scale Flying V, the one with the giant turbofans, the one that carries 360 passengers across an ocean, has never been built. Not yet. Not a single one. It exists as an extremely detailed design, as thousands of hours of simulations, as scale models and full-size cabin mock-ups you can actually walk through. But no full-size Flying V has ever taxied down a real runway under its own power. What has flown is a scale model. Back in 2020, the team built a remote-controlled flying model of the Flying V with a wingspan of about 3 meters, hauled it out to an airbase in Germany, and successfully flew it. A drone pilot lifted it up into the air at around 80 kilometers an hour, and it flew beautifully, matching a huge amount of what the computer models and the wind tunnel had predicted it would do. The telemetry streamed back clean, the low-drag aerodynamics held up under real conditions, and the team celebrated a genuine, hard-won milestone. And that flight was the payoff after a long, unglamorous grind of preparation. Before that little model ever left the ground, it went through a whole battery of ground tests and wind tunnel runs back in the Netherlands, so the team could predict exactly how it ought to behave once it was airborne. A small crew of dedicated researchers and engineers built it by hand. A specialist drone pilot flew it, and together they coaxed it up into the sky and then carefully guided it back down again, watching the data pour in the entire time. The big result was reassurance. The way the real model actually flew lined up closely with everything the simulations had promised, which is precisely what you desperately want to see when you're betting years of hard work on a genuinely radical shape. But here's the crucial catch. That little model was not powered by any monster turbofan. It flew on small electric motors. It was, in essence, a very sophisticated, very expensive, very carefully engineered drone. And a 3-meter electric model, as brilliant as it is, can only tell you so much. A lot of the questions that really, truly matter, especially the ones around those giant engines and how they tangle with the full-size wing, simply cannot be answered by a lightweight electric model at all. As of the last few years, that 2020 flight remains the only time any physical flying V has actually flown. So the work moved onward into ever more detailed computer simulations and studies, chipping away at the hardest problems one stubborn piece at a time. And the leap from that 3-Matra model up to a full-scale, passenger-carrying flying V is not a small step, it's a genuine chasm. A real aircraft would need years of flight testing with actual test pilots, an enormous certification campaign with aviation regulators poring over every single system, and, almost certainly, billions upon billions of dollars in funding. The kind of money only a major manufacturer or a government-backed program can realistically lay on the table. Remember, even Boeing, with all of its vast resources and experience, spent 7 years and $15 billion just to get one conventional new widebody close to the finish line. A radical tailless research concept faces every one of those same hurdles, and then a whole stack of brand new ones piled on top. That's the honest scale of the gap between a promising idea and a plane you can actually buy a ticket on. None of which makes the flying V any less exciting, by the way. It just makes it real. So just sit with that for a second, because it's honestly kind of poetic. The enormous engine at the very center of this entire story is, for right now, a thing that exists mostly on paper, in simulation, and in wind tunnel data. It's the giant that the whole aircraft is being obsessively, painstakingly shaped around, and yet the only flying V that has ever felt real air moving under its wings did it silently, gently, on batteries. The engine is the goal. The engine is the constraint. The engine is the North Star that every other single design decision quietly bends toward. It's the reason the wing is shaped the way it is, the reason the nacelles are being endlessly repositioned, the reason the entire project is so fiendishly hard. And it hasn't even physically shown up to the party yet. Which leads us straight into the last big question. If the enormous turbofan is where we are standing right now, then where does aircraft propulsion actually go from here? What comes next after the giants? And this is the part that makes the flying V so much more than just a cool shape for a poster on a teenager's wall. It was deliberately, intentionally designed to be adaptable. In its current form, it burns regular kerosene, the same jet fuel that everything else in the sky runs on today. But the entire point of a research aircraft like this is to leave the door standing wide open for whatever comes next. From the very beginning, the engineers have talked openly about adapting it to electrically boosted turbofans, engines that blend the giant efficient fan we've spent this whole video obsessing over with an assist from electric power, to squeeze out even more efficiency than either approach could manage on its own. It's built to run on 100% sustainable aviation fuel from the start. And in the longer term, the whole industry is chasing even more radical ideas, like hydrogen power. Although, to be completely honest with you, those timelines have quietly stretched out toward the 2040s as the sheer, stubborn difficulty of that particular engineering challenge has become impossible to ignore. It's worth unpacking that phrase, electrically boosted turbofan, for a moment, because it hints at where a lot of this is really heading. The idea is to keep the giant, efficient fan we've spent this whole video obsessing over, but to blend electric motors into the mix, drawing on stored power to give the engine an assist at the exact moments it needs it most, like takeoff and the initial climb, when engines are straining hardest and gulping the most fuel. Fuse the brute reliability of a jet engine with a well-timed jolt of electric help, and you can potentially run the entire system leaner. It is emphatically not the same thing as a fully electric airliner, which for something the size of the flying V is still firmly out of reach because batteries are simply far, far too heavy to haul 360 people across an ocean. It's a hybrid, a bridge, a clever way to wring even more efficiency out of the kind of machines we already know how to build and trust. And the fact that the flying V was designed from the very start to accept that sort of upgrade, rather than being welded forever to one single type of engine, is a huge part of what makes it a genuine research platform and not just a pretty rendering that looks good on a screen. That is exactly why an aircraft like the Flying V matters, even if you personally never once set foot on one. It's a test bed. It's a place to try the wild, risky, expensive ideas on a shape that no airline has ever actually committed to buying. Because every enormous, efficient, whisper-quiet engine we've talked about tonight, every record-breaking fan, every power gearbox and composite blade and ceramic turbine exists for one simple, stubborn reason. Someone, somewhere, flatly refused to accept that the way we've always done it is the very best we could ever do. And maybe that, right there, is the real lesson buried deep inside this whole thing. We started with a plane that looks physically impossible and an engine that sounds mathematically absurd. But when you take it apart, piece by piece, layer by layer, what you find waiting for you at the very bottom isn't magic at all. It's just people. People staring hard at a genuinely difficult problem, asking the same stubborn, patient question over and over and over again. What if we made the fan a little bigger? What if we moved the engine somewhere nobody has ever dared to put it before? What if the whole plane bent itself around the thing that pushes it, instead of the other way around? Every single giant leap in the history of flight started out as exactly that kind of quiet, slightly crazy, slightly stubborn question. The flying V might fly someday. It might not. Plenty of brilliant, beautiful concepts never make it past the model stage, and that's just the honest, unsentimental truth of engineering. But the enormous engine at its heart and the relentless, patient, decade-long work it demands, that part is very, very real. And it is already quietly reshaping how the smartest people in aviation think about the future of flight itself. Because here's the thing about a project like this one. Its real value might not even be the flying V ever entering service at all. Its real value is every single lesson learned along the way. Every simulation that teaches engineers how a top-mounted engine disturbs the air over a wing. Every wind tunnel run that reveals how a tailless aircraft secretly wants to behave. Every one of those hard-won insights flows straight back into the wider world of aviation, into the next generation of more conventional planes, into the way the entire field thinks about efficiency and shape and power. Even a concept that never carries a single paying passenger can quietly shove the whole industry a step forward, because that is how real progress almost always works. Not in one dramatic, cinematic leap, but in 1,000 careful, patient experiments, most of which the public never even hears a word about. So here is what I'll leave you with. The next time you're crammed into a window seat, half asleep, staring out at that giant fan spinning slowly under the wing, remember what you're actually looking at. You are looking at one of the most extreme, most refined pieces of engineering that human beings have ever figured out how to build, over and over, thousands of times. A machine that survives fire and ice and bird strikes without ever once letting you feel a thing. And somewhere out there right now, in a quiet lab in the Netherlands, someone is bent over a glowing screen, trying to work out how to bolt one of those magnificent monsters onto the strangest, most beautiful wing in the entire sky. What do you honestly think? Will we ever actually see a flying V full of passengers crossing an ocean in our lifetime? Or is it destined to stay a gorgeous idea that never quite made it off the drawing board? Drop your answer down in the comments, because I read them, and I genuinely want to know where you land on this one.